A man who used to personally advise Vladimir Putin on economic policy just stood up in public and predicted the end of his regime, and the death of the man himself. 24 hours later, he was fired. And that single phone call from the Kremlin tells you more about the state of Russia right now than almost anything coming out of the defense ministry. Here's exactly what happened. The chief economist of one of Russia's largest banks, a man who spent years inside rooms most Russians will never see, personally advising Putin on how to manage the country's economy, stood in front of an audience and said the quiet part out loud, that the current trajectory ends with the regime collapsing, and with it, quite possibly, Putin himself. Not a hedge. Not a careful, diplomatically worded warning about structural headwinds. A direct, public prediction of downfall and death from a man who used to be inside the room when the real numbers were discussed. It didn't take long for the Kremlin to notice. Someone with enough authority to make a call like this personally reached out to the bank and made it clear this man needed to be gone. The next day he was. No public trial, no drawn-out scandal, just a quiet, immediate removal, the kind that sends an unmistakable message to everyone else in Russia's financial and political establishment who might be thinking the same thing but hasn't said it out loud yet. And here's the part that should actually worry the Kremlin far more than losing one economist. He wasn't alone. Other Russian political strategists and military analysts have been circling the exact same warning, in their own words, through their own channels, for weeks. When more than one person inside a system built on obedience starts independently reaching the same dark conclusion about where that system is headed, that's not noise. That's the beginning of a pattern, and patterns like this are exactly what authoritarian governments fear most, because they can silence one voice easily. They cannot silence a trend. The response from the loyalist side has been just as telling. Hardline pro-war politicians have started publicly attacking anyone who even entertains the idea that Russia might need to give up territory to end this war, calling them traitors, saying they hate their own country, insisting that anyone who doesn't fully support the invasion should be stripped of their citizenship and shown the door. It's the kind of rhetoric that only escalates when the people saying it sense the ground shifting underneath them. You don't need to publicly threaten to strip your critics of citizenship if you're confident nobody's listening to them. You do it when you're worried that people are. Now layer the military pressure on top of all of that, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. While all of this political tension was building inside Russia's own institutions, Ukraine kept adding pressure from the outside, exactly the way it has for months. On a single night, hundreds of drones went out across Russian territory, with a meaningful number aimed directly at the capital. Moscow's elite, the people who normally experience this war through a television screen and a state-approved news summary, got a very direct taste of what the rest of the country has been living with for a long time. This wasn't an isolated night either. It landed in the middle of a broader stretch of days that saw the largest coordinated drone activity of the entire war. Well over 1,000 drones combined across back-to-back nights, targeting the capital directly, straining air defense crews who had to treat every radar contact as a potential threat for hours on end without a break. Whatever the exact final tally on any single night, the pattern by now is unmistakable. The strikes keep getting larger, they keep landing closer to the center of Russian power, and they keep arriving on a timeline that gives Moscow less and less room to recover between waves. For the political elite watching all of this from inside the capital, the message underneath the message is simple. The war they've spent years describing as something happening far away, to other people, on someone else's front line, is now something they personally have to think about every time the sun goes down. There's a reason this kind of pressure lands differently on Moscow's elite than it does on the general public. Ordinary Russians in border regions have lived with this reality for years, and, however unfairly, have had time to adjust. The people inside Russia's financial and political establishment, the ones who fly private, who send their children abroad, who have spent this entire war believing distance from the front line meant distance from consequences, are only now being forced to reckon with a version of the war that reaches them personally. That reckoning, more than any single number of drones or dollars in damage, may be exactly what's driving a bank's chief economist to say the quiet part out loud in public, consequences be damned. Here's the strange part, the part that doesn't fit neatly into either side's version of events. The attack itself happened at night, but the blackout didn't hit during the attack. It hit the following morning, after residents near a substation heard a loud pop. By that point, there were no drones left in the sky. Nobody official has fully explained what actually caused it. Maybe a drone strike from the night before did quiet structural damage that only fully failed hours later. Maybe it was something else entirely. Aging Russian infrastructure, finally giving out under stress it was never built to handle, with the timing simply making it look connected. Either explanation is plausible, and either one is bad news for the Kremlin. One means the drone campaign is now causing damage on a delay, invisible until it isn't. The other means Russia's own infrastructure is failing on its own, with or without Ukrainian help, and the war is just accelerating a collapse that was already coming. Emergency crews reportedly worked for hours trying to isolate the fault before power could be safely restored to the affected blocks, rerouting the grid section by section, while engineers argued over whether the damage traced back to the substation itself or to something further up the line. In the meantime, backup generators kicked in at a handful of critical buildings, while ordinary offices and apartment blocks simply sat without power, phone signal patchy, elevators locked mid-shaft, waiting for an all-clear that took most of the morning to arrive. Whatever the actual cause, the effect was immediate and public. Parts of Moscow, including its own business district, went dark. Around 10 people were reportedly trapped inside an elevator at a theater, unable to get out without help, sitting in the dark, while the rest of the city tried to figure out what had just happened and why nobody in charge seemed to have a clear answer. Outage reports surged across the region in the hours that followed. For a government that spends enormous energy projecting total control, a stalled elevator in the capital's own business district, with no drones in sight and no clean explanation available, is its own kind of humiliation, smaller than a burning refinery, but in some ways more embarrassing, because it happened in broad daylight, with no war footage to distract from it. Picture what this actually looks like from inside the Kremlin's own communications machinery right now, because the coordination problem here is real. An aide has to decide how to brief the president on a chief economist publicly predicting his death, on the same week that Moscow's own business district loses power for reasons nobody can definitively explain. Do you downplay both? Do you address one and hope the other gets buried in the news cycle? Every option carries risk, because the one thing an authoritarian system cannot afford is the appearance that it doesn't fully understand what's happening inside its own borders. And right now, on both the economic and the infrastructure front, that's exactly the appearance being created, whether anyone intends it or not. Western analysts watching this from the outside have started reading these two threads, the elite economic descent and the drone campaign, as connected rather than coincidental. The argument goes like this: military pressure alone rarely breaks an authoritarian government because the people running it can absorb battlefield losses for a very long time without feeling it personally. What actually erodes a system like this is the moment military pressure starts generating economic and political costs that reach the people closest to power, the bankers, the technocrats, the people who manage the money rather than the front line. A chief economist predicting collapse isn't a battlefield event. It's a sign that the economic cost of this war has finally reached high enough into Russia's own establishment that even insiders are running the numbers and not liking what they see. That reading lines up with something else worth noting: the timing. This economist didn't make his prediction during a quiet stretch of the war. He made it in the same window as the most intense drone activity Moscow has faced all year, with strikes landing on infrastructure, on logistics, and now apparently on the power grid in the capital's own business district. Whether he was directly reacting to that specific pressure, or simply chose that moment because the ground was already shifting under his feet, either way, the coincidence itself is doing real work. It tells the rest of Russia's financial establishment that the war's costs and the capital's vulnerability are now visibly intersecting, in public, in a way that's much harder to wave away as fringe pessimism. This didn't emerge from nowhere either. Russia has been wrestling with a fuel crisis stretching back through last year and into this one, severe enough to shut down ordinary filling stations in region after region. That crisis traces back to the same drone campaign hammering Russia's refineries all summer. A Moscow area refinery burning in June, a facility deep in Siberia, and an oil depot in the south both hit by July. Each strike chipping away at the same fuel supply that keeps the country's economy, and its military logistics, actually moving. Layer a slow-burning energy crisis underneath elite economists' warning of collapse, underneath hardliners threatening to strip citizenship from anyone who steps out of line, underneath a business district blackout nobody can fully explain, and you start to see why the mood inside Russia's own institutions has shifted from confident to defensive in a matter of months. None of these threads on their own would be a crisis. Stacked together, in the same summer, they start to look like exactly what the departed economist warned about out loud before he lost his job for saying it. History offers a blunt lesson here, and it isn't unique to Russia. Authoritarian systems rarely collapse because a single dramatic event forces the issue overnight. They erode first, quietly, at the edges, through exactly this kind of thing. An insider breaking ranks in public, a punishment that's swift but can't actually silence the underlying belief. A state media apparatus that has to work harder each month to paper over problems that used to stay invisible. By the time the erosion becomes impossible to hide from ordinary citizens, insiders have usually already been feeling it for months, sometimes years. If that pattern is repeating here, the public firing of one high-profile economist isn't the beginning of the story. It's simply the first piece of it that leaked far enough to make international headlines. It's worth being precise about what's actually being claimed here, because it would be easy to overstate this. Nobody credible is reporting that Vladimir Putin has decided to surrender, or that the war is ending this week, or that the regime has already fallen. That is not what happened, and claiming otherwise would be exactly the kind of dishonest reporting this channel isn't interested in doing. What actually happened is narrower, and in some ways more interesting. A Kremlin-adjacent insider said the quiet part out loud, got punished for it within 24 hours, and in the same stretch of days, the capital city both got hit by hundreds of drones and suffered an unexplained blackout in its own business district. Whether that combination is the beginning of something bigger, or just a rough week that gets memory holed by next month, is a real, open question, and it's one that even people close to Putin himself now appear to be asking, whether the Kremlin wants them to or not. There's also a quieter signal worth flagging. What state media chose not to say. In a media environment this tightly controlled, the absence of a strong, coordinated rebuttal to the economist's warning is itself informative. A confident government with nothing to worry about typically responds to a prediction like this with mockery, with a parade of loyal experts calling it nonsense, with a media cycle designed to bury the story under ridicule within 48 hours. Instead, the response here was quieter and more surgical, a single phone call, a single firing, and a hope that the story fades on its own without ever needing a public rebuttal that might accidentally lend the original warning more credibility than silence does. Compare this moment to where Russia's internal messaging stood even a year ago, when public dissent from anyone with real Kremlin proximity was essentially unheard of, and hardliners didn't need to publicly threaten critics because there weren't visible critics to threaten. The fact that both of those things are now happening in the open, in the same news cycle as a drone campaign hitting the capital directly, is the actual story here. Not a single dramatic headline, but the visible erosion of a control that used to be far more airtight than this. And that's really the uncomfortable position the Kremlin finds itself in right now. You can fire one economist, you can threaten 100 critics with losing their citizenship, you can even, eventually, patch a blackout in one business district and quietly bury the cause of the pop that started it. What you can't do is fire every analyst who's quietly reaching the same conclusion in private, and you can't outshout a fuel crisis, a drone campaign, and a growing whisper network of people close to power who are starting to hedge their bets in public rather than stay silent. So here's where this actually stands. A man who once advised Putin directly on the economy predicted his downfall and lost his job for it within a day. Other analysts are saying versions of the same thing through other channels. Hardliners are responding with threats instead of reassurance, which is itself a signal. And in the same stretch of days, hundreds of drones hit Russian territory, including the capital, followed by a business district blackout nobody in power has fully explained. None of that proves the war ends tomorrow. All of it proves that the story Russia tells itself about being firmly in control is getting harder to keep straight, one uncomfortable week at a time. Whether this is the start of a real crack running through Russia's own institutions, or just a bruising few days that gets quietly smoothed over the way every previous bad week eventually was, is a question nobody inside the Kremlin is willing to answer honestly in public. But for the first time in a long time, it's a question being asked out loud by people who used to be part of the answer. And that may be the detail that matters most here, more than any single statistic. Wars like this one are rarely decided by the moment a government formally admits defeat. They're decided by the slow accumulation of moments just like this one. A fired economist, an unexplained blackout, a hardliner's threat that reveals more fear than strength, a fuel crisis nobody can spin their way out of. Individually, the Kremlin can survive any one of these. Survive enough of them stacked in the same summer, arriving faster than the last one gets forgotten, and eventually the question stops being whether the system cracks and starts being how long it can keep pretending it hasn't. Nobody watching this closely is predicting an ending next week. But for a system built almost entirely on the appearance of total control, the fact that the appearance itself is now visibly slipping, in public, from people who used to be trusted with the truth before anyone else, is exactly the kind of story that looks small in the moment and enormous in hindsight. Keep watching two things in the weeks ahead, because they'll tell you more than any single headline will. First, whether any other Kremlin-adjacent figure, a banker, a strategist, a retired official, repeats a version of this same warning in public, since one voice is an incident, but a second or third is a trend nobody can dismiss as one bad afternoon. Second, whether Moscow's infrastructure keeps failing in these small, unexplained ways between the major drone waves, because a government that can withstand a single dramatic strike can still be worn down by a slow accumulation of pops, outages, and blackouts nobody can fully account for. Either signal on its own would be worth watching. Both together, in the same summer, are exactly the kind of pattern that tends to look obvious only after it's already too late to reverse.